Representative Jennings,
Excused.
Representative Nemec,
Here.
Representative Oakley,
Excused.
Representative Provenza. Here. Representative Rodriguez Williams. Here. And Chairman Washut.
Here. I think Representative Jennings is joining us now. Show him as present. So just a few announcements before we get started today. We welcome everybody here bright and early on this Friday morning. Please turn your cell phones off. If you need to take a phone call, please step out of the room. If you intend to propose a substantive or lengthy amendment, Representative Oakley is present, show her in attendance. If you plan on proposing a substantive or lengthy amendment to a bill, please provide a written copy of that to our staff and to each member of the committee. If you need to make copies, there's a copy center across the hallway. The meeting is being streamed live on the legislature's website. Link is located on the meeting calendar page. Those not wishing to testify online are encouraged to watch via the YouTube channel rather than taking up a spot on the queue on the legislature's website. Typically, we start with the bill sponsor and any key witness that the sponsor may have brought along, other legislators wishing to testify, state agency and court officials, then representatives of interested organizations and members of the general public. We ask all those who are testifying to press the button on the microphone that says push until the little green light comes on. Say your name. And if you're new to this committee, please spell your last name for us. It's for the record. Please speak clearly, speak up so that the committee, those in the room and those listening online can all hear and understand you. Add the name of any organization or agency that you represent as you introduce yourself. If you're here as a private citizen, please tell us where in this great state you reside. Remember that all dialogue must first be addressed to the chair. Witnesses are expected to remain polite and civil during their testimony. Audience members online wishing to testify should register now using the testify button provided on the committee's meeting notice. Those registering will be emailed a link to participate via the Zoom platform. Handouts for the committee should be transmitted to each committee member and to the staff. For those online, at the time I call for your public testimony on a topic, those wishing to testify may raise a virtual hand, will be called on as time allows. Staff will then modify the attendees' credentials at that point, which will allow you the video feed to come into the room and we'll be able to hear your testimony. Typically, public testimony should last no longer than 3 minutes unless an extension is granted by the chairman. We're a little loose on that when we don't have many people wishing to testify, but we'll play it by ear as we move through the day. I will have access to see which attendees have raised their hands, and I will do my best to give you a heads up when we're starting to call on people out there in the virtual world. Once a virtual attendee has concluded their testimony or does not anticipate providing testimony, please monitor the proceedings via the YouTube channel and open up a spot in the queue for the testimony. The bill or bills discussed are located on the meeting calendar page for the legislature website. We'll begin this morning with House Bill 157. 157. There's Representative Larson here. I don't see him. What's that? Okay. We'll wait one moment, see if was it?
Was about this good as a Boy Scout.
Good morning, Representative Larson. Please introduce yourself for the record and tell us what we need to know about House Bill 157.
I will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lloyd Larson, representative from House District 54. You all will recall last year that when we brought a bill that allowed the county commissioners to have the ability to dissolve boards that they created, which is I fully support and think is the right thing to do. If you can create, you should have the ability for dissolution as well. You'll recall last year in some of that conversation, we said, if we do this, is there any potential for do we need any additional sideboards? And we had talked about that, thought, well, let's just see how this goes. And if in its purest form, we see this rolling out and doing well, then we've been successful. The concern that's come up in my county, and I've heard from a couple of other counties, is sometimes the commissioners, and we're all human, get a little frustrated with the board and will come back and say, you know, if you guys don't play nice, we're going to dissolve you. So play nice. And that's fine, but what if the board's doing what they're supposed to do? And if the board's doing what they're supposed to do, then I don't think the commissioners should be able to have that ability to dissolve them. So last year we had considered some language, and which we're actually bringing back, that I propose to bring back in there, that says before a board can be dissolved, or as part of this whole conversation, that a board or district specified in A of this section should be dissolved for only one or more of the following reasons. One, the purpose for which the board is created is no longer exists or has not been fulfilled. Then you can, or a majority of appointed board members determine that it's not best interest of the residents of the district. So if the board says, why do we still exist? And that happens. So let's dissolve it or get out of it. And that seems to be a very simple thing in one. And then if the board or district has neglected or refused to perform its duties, is a reason for it to be dissolved. And the board or district has engaged in criminal conduct, and the board or district has engaged. So what we're doing, what I'm trying to do here is just define, put a little more definition and guidelines for the commissioners to understand what causes are there for a board to be dissolved, and likewise for a board to understand these are the things that we really need to make sure that we're doing, or we stand in jeopardy of a dissolution. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Representative, can you tell us a little bit about how this dovetails with the museum boards, which we just dealt with a few days ago?
Well, Mr. Chairman, in fairness, I don't know that I can answer that really well. I wasn't in favor of moving the museum boards out of there. I really do believe that if a board is created by the commissioners ought to have the ability to dissolve that board. I think that's just a logical process. So I wasn't overly, I would have liked to have seen these sideboards in there and see if that just couldn't have moved forward, but we've moved that bill forward. So I don't know that I can answer the rationale for moving why the museum boards were removed out of this. We have fair boards in here. One of the boards in my county that seems to be a little wound up about this, and has for the last couple of years, has been the solid waste district board. And the solid waste district, as you all understand, is created by the commissioners, and then it's a self-governing board, and the citizens of the district in which the solid waste district is votes to impose a levy for the handling of solid waste, and they have authority of the board to buy and dispose of land, equipment, property, to set the wages of the employees of the solid waste districts. They're almost self-sufficient. They have to bring their budget, as most boards do, back to the commissioners. The commissioners can line item and as you're all aware of, we sometimes you'll get a disgruntled commissioner that thinks maybe one of the employees is getting paid too much or something to that degree. And so they'll say, you know, we'll just dissolve you if you don't take care of that. Well, that's their job. That's fitting within there. And I don't think, you know, should we have to do this? No, but here we are, and just trying to take that, give a little more direction there, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, any questions for Representative Larson? Representative Craigle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Larson. So just as we look at on page 3, the bottom Romanet 5, it says the board or district has engaged in malfeasance or has misused public funds. I'm just wondering if that language is actually necessary in the bill. Wouldn't that fit into Romanet 4 above as other misconduct, or are we just creating confusion within the bill that we don't need?
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And can I, Mr. Chairman, I'm just getting a few ahead. So when I forget to say that, I can draw on the bank. See,
I'll help you.
So, Mr. Chairman, I reached out to the association, and this really is some language they had crafted last year. I really think that you're accurate on that, but I think if there's, I'm fine at that language, because I think that you're right, Representative Craigo, maybe is also fits up under Romanet 4, but I would be interested in seeing what the association, maybe they are seeing that from a different perspective on that. And so maybe reserve that until we hear from them and see what their thoughts are. But I would initially agree with that.
Further questions, sir? Representative Larson? So just so I'm clear, nothing in this bill undoes the museum board bill that we just passed.
No, sir, Mr. Chairman, again.
All right. Anyone else? Question, Representative Jennings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But if that bill doesn't pass, they would fall under this. Is that correct?
So Mr.
Representative
Chairman, as I understand that museum board, we pulled that museum board section completely out of here. And so this would only apply to those boards that the county commissioners still have authority to dissolve.
Representative Larson, I think the question was if the museum board bill fails to pass,
yes,
then this process would apply.
Mr. Chairman, in Representative Jennings, I apologize. I didn't understand it that way. Yes. So if that bill failed and they were left in here, this would apply to them, of course. Thank you.
Further questions? All right. Anyone else? Mr. Riemann?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. Maybe I can help a little bit with the confusion. I'll start with the museum districts issue. The short answer is that was a political compromise relative to the museum districts last year. And you all passed an amendment that removed museum districts. Unfortunately, in the rush to draft that amendment, it only removed the museum districts from one part of the bill and left museum districts in the other part of the bill. So that bill is simply clarifying what you all did last year and trying not to leave that confusion for my members who will be looking at this in the future and seeing that in one part of statute, they have the power to dissolve museum districts, and in another part, they don't. So that's all that bill does, is just clean up an error that was made last legislative session.
So Mr. Riemann, what would be the effect of this bill if the museum board political compromise bill, as you referred to it, doesn't pass the body?
Mr. Chairman, it kind of leaves that limbo. And quite frankly, the way I would read it, commissioners would have the authority to dissolve museum districts under the existing statute. And then if this one passed, subject to these sideboards.
So back on this bill, Mr. Freeman.
All right. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I do appreciate Representative Larson working with me on this particular legislation. I will say in relationship to the Fremont County experience, the commissioners would dispute the fact that anyone has ever said that they were going to dissolve that particular board. But that's not something I think we need to really get too tied up in. This language is language that I worked to develop and did share in part last year as one possible approach that we could take to establishing some sideboards. And with that perspective, I don't think that we have a tremendous heartburn over this particular legislation. To Representative Crago's question about provision 5, I don't know that I have a problem with striking that language with the understanding that that would come under provision number 4. Mr. Chairman, I hate to do this, but I will gladly provide you with a written copy of this if you want to bring it to the body later. But there is one provision that I just realized this morning was left out of this particular draft that Representative Larson and I did discuss, and I will happily work with him. And that was a provision that would have read at the very end that the county commissioners, it would read this way: the county commissioners determine dissolution is necessary to reorganize or consolidate the functions of the board or the district. I had drafted that language because, as some of you may remember, this whole issue started here in Laramie County, where the Board of County Commissioners felt that they could find some efficiencies by moving their fair board into a department of the county. In that case, the fair board took them to court to say they didn't have the power to dissolve. Initially, the court said that the county commissioners did have that power. It went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, there's no dissolution authority. And that's what started this whole process. And so I had crafted that language to ensure that that power would remain and we wouldn't lose that authority here. So again, I don't have that in writing for you this very second. I would bring that back to you for a floor amendment if necessary, but I would appreciate your consideration. Mr. Chairman, there's one other thing, and I don't like to spring things on the representative that I missed in our conversations. In existing state statute as it relates to all special districts, there's a provision, and that provision is 2229-401A Romanet 3B, and that says that the county commissioners may dissolve special district if the county commissioners determine it is in the best interest of the county residents. The existing piece here, and that's my fault, I'm going to claim that entirely here, says that a majority of the appointed board members. I would assume that the appointed board members in this instance are those that were appointed by the Board of County Commissioners, not the county commissioners themselves. And so just so that there's some consistency, I might ask that you also give a majority of the Board of County Commissioners or the appointed board members determine it's in the best interests of, or maybe it needs to be its own provision, but that is one other one. I don't want to spring it on anybody. I want us to all work on it together. That was my intent working with Representative Larson on this, but it is one thing that I did recognize as a distinction between existing special district law and what this would do. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd stand for any questions.
Representative Craigle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Mr. Raymond, so if we were to put that in Romanet 2, I mean, then we really don't need any other provisions in the law or in the bill. I mean, if we just say the county commissioners on a whim can decide it's not in the best interests of their citizens, they can dissolve the board, then why are we, then we're sort of taking out all the sideboards. Am I wrong in that?
Mr. Reaman.
Mr. Chairman, you certainly could look at it that way. That's not my intent. As Representative Larson knows from our conversations, I've also suggested that there could be language to the effect of, let me just pull it up so that that the commissioners could not do that for arbitrary reasons or otherwise in bad faith. I want this to be done for the right reasons, not for a whim. And so I am interested in working with the body to make sure that that's not the case.
Follow up, Representative Craigle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And also going back to 2229, I think it's 401 that on the special districts. I mean, there are, and I don't have the statute in front of me, but just off the top of my head, if I remember correctly, there are other sideboards in that statute as it relates to special districts, because special districts have elected officials, elected boards versus this, what we're talking about with this particular bill and the law we worked on last year. Those are appointed members. I mean, this does not apply to special districts that are created under statute under one of the other enabling acts for them. We're talking two different animals, correct?
Representative or Mr. Reaman.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Craigle, you're absolutely correct. They are different animals. Under that provision, however, that I read, that is, if the commissioners come to that determination, that is one of the sole reasons that they could dissolve a special district.
Representative Craigle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I'll go grab the statute, but I think there's other things ahead of that in the process before they can actually take that step. Am I wrong?
Mr. Reaman.
Mr.
If
Chairman,
you know.
attempting to pull it up myself. So, Mr. Chairman, 2229-401A says a dissolution of a district may be initiated, and there's provision 3 says by resolution of county commissioners if either either the district at the time of the regular district election has not elected district directors as required by the principal act, or 2, the territory within the district is uninhabited, and the commissioners determine that it is in the best interest of, and this is, sorry, that was in the either, then there's a B, and the B says the county commissioners determine that it is in the best interest of the people that the county that the district be dissolved and liquidated. I don't see any other provisions.
Representative Craigle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it has to meet one of the first 2 criteria. So either the district has failed to elect directors, or the district is uninhabited. So one of those first 2 qualifications have to be met first. And on top of one of or the other of those 2, the commissioners decide it's in the best interest. So they can't just say, oh, we decide it's in the best interest to get rid of the district. There is sideboards. It has to be one of those 2 things before the commissioners can make that decision, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I would defer to the good country lawyer.
Any further questions for Mr. Reaman? Representative Chesting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Reaman, could you read the first amendment that you were talking about at the very end that you might be proposing? I just wanted to rehear that because I think I may have a question about it. Go ahead.
Mr. Reaman, your first amendment.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Chestik, that would be the county commissioners determine dissolution is necessary to reorganize or consolidate the functions of the board or district.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Chestik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm a little bit concerned. I know that you represent the county commissioners, but it's our job to represent the entire county and all the population. I'm just worried that you're creating exceptions here that swallow the rule or could potentially. So by adding the county commissioners to Romanet I or Romanet 2 on page 3, line 1, and the language you just read that you may be proposing as an amendment, seems like it gives the commissioners pretty broad power. It's going to be easy for the commissioners to say, we think this is in the best interest. And it's going to be hard for anybody to disagree with that because it's the commissioner's job to determine that. They can make that determination for whatever reason. But it seems like when you create a board or a district, sometimes you need to give that board or district some independence and give them some freedom to do what they're supposed to do and do it in the right way, free of political pressure. And that's, it seems like these provisions you're proposing to put back in allows the commissioners some flexibility to put political pressure on the boards. And I'm a little concerned about that. You say you want the boards to be dissolved for the right reasons. I appreciate that. And I want that too. But I just fear that this language could be misused and could be a loophole that the commissioners could just say, we think this is in the best interest. And what they think is, and that the motive behind that may be a political thing. So what's your reaction to are there ways to potentially limit this and make sure that we can provide those boards and districts with the independence that they need to do their jobs properly?
Mr. Riemann, your response?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Chestick, I'm trying to, in this language, avoid the situation that we got ourselves into that brought this legislation forward. And so my language is simply intended to maintain the authority by which we came forward to receive the legislation that you all passed last year. Without that language, I'm hard pressed to find another provision under this bill that would allow for Laramie County to do what they had wanted to do that led to the Supreme Court decision. And if I can't get language of this sort, then I will have to oppose this legislation because, again, we were trying to ensure that the county commissioners, if they found a reason that was, not arbitrary, not in bad faith, to come forward and move forward with dissolution of that district. In this instance, commission in Laramie County commissioners had no interest in, doing away with the fair. That's an important part of the community. They just felt that there were better efficiencies that could be achieved elsewhere. And I don't see in any of these other provisions where the Board of County Commissioners would have any authority to do that. In fact, the vast majority of these would either put it in the power of the board, the appointed board itself, or only in 2 instances because of neglect or malfeasance that the county commissioners would have any power. So trying to maintain some sort of space here that the county commissioners would have some decision-making authority under this particular bill.
Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I actually have a question, I think, for each, the good representative and Mr. Ryman, because it seems like that we're discussing the bill and the amendment possibly at the same time here. And so to piggyback off of Representative to my right, Mr. Ryman, if we remove the word, the one that gives me consternation here, I love this bill. I don't think it's very much of a threat. We almost never want to downsize in government. We seem to know how to put more stuff in place. So, but the word that gives me a little bit of pause in reference to what the good representative said is reorganize. And so I'm all for giving the commissioners the opportunity to dissolve if they have those sideboards. But to reorganize seems like that might give the county commissioners the political will to change the direction of a board or something of that nature, which might not have been the will of the people. And so I like your response to that. And then to the good representative, again, really like this bill, like to dissolve. Maybe we could just start over, dissolve them all and start over. We're given permission here. And I assume, but I wanted to ask you, is there a process in statute already that would allow them to, or make them, how does that happen? If we give them this power, I mean, how do they decide what to do with all the equipment or land or, you know, things of that nature? Are we just giving them the power? And so there's the two
Whichever of you
questions.
wishes to jump in first.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jennings, I'm entirely open to nitpicking the words that I chose there. What I was trying to do with those two particular words, just starting with reorganizing. No, my intent there isn't that the county commissioners are just going to go blow up the thing and use it as a reorganization. But what I was attempting to do there is take into account what Laramie County was trying to do. They were trying to reorganize from an appointed board to a department for efficiency's sake. With consolidate, there are cases, in fact, I'm dealing with one right now. You're going to see a bill coming out of the Senate where we have 2 solid waste districts in Weston County that want to consolidate, but there's not a mechanism for those 2 appointed boards to come together, which obviously would then build some efficiencies, may provide some better administration and financial approach at the local level. So again, I'm open to nitpicking those words and trying to wordsmith a bit here and get it. I think you understand what I'm trying to get at here, and it does come with good intent, I promise you.
Any further questions for the witness? Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Jennings, and I apologize, I'm going a bit off memory there, but so if a dissolution takes place, and those of you that have statutes can correct me on this, but I believe then in that dissolution process, if there's assets still existing, debts existing, they can sell the assets, satisfy the debts. If there's funds available after the disposal of all assets, and that there's a process for how that comes back into the county, I believe. So there is a process for disposing of debt and of assets within that. I'm a little bit, Mr. Chairman, if satisfying that question, a question that I have is, I thought we had the provisions in the existing language to, and I'm not, the intent of the original bill I support, and I thought the bill as it came out last year allowed us to take care of the very problem that we're saying now we have to reinsert language to take care of. And so I'm not tracking with that. So absence of adding that language back in, where did we take it out of? Is it by the placement of this new language I have in here, or how did we suddenly change what we accomplished last year in this dissolution process?
Representative Jennings, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Raymond, if we remove the one word of, I mean, because I understand consolidation and I'm all in for that, but if we removed reorganization, do you see that as harmful to your amendment? And would it not relieve some of the political potential for things going bad?
Mr. Raymond.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jennings, are you suggesting if we took out the reorganization and just left consolidation, would that be enough to address my issue and take care of the 2 instances I provided you? Is that, Mr. Chairman, I don't know that it does, but I'd have to perhaps get into the dictionary and look at that a little bit further before I could give you a solid answer on that.
Any further questions? Anyone else in the room wishing to testify on House Bill 151? Representative Harold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I can direct this to probably either one of you guys. So obviously we heard of a solid waste board that was concerned. Maybe that's where this started, but have we had an issue that has arisen over the last year where we're like, man, what we passed last year just isn't covering what needs to be covered? Obviously, I understand we had a misdrafting on that other amendment that we fixed with that bill on museum boards. But other than that, have we actually seen an issue? Or are we just trying to get ahead of a potential issue? Is that what this is? And then honestly, I kind of feel like in some ways we're getting a bit of a contradiction going now with we're going to put all these sideboards on, and then we're going to then put in kind of like this button that says, never mind, we can eliminate the sideboards when we hit that. So I'm a little confused I wasn't confused until the last 10 minutes, and then I became more confused, if we're being 100% honest.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Harrelson, I will tell you that in my county, the sky has not fallen at all. Okay. And it's just the sideboard conversations you hear as a representative within your county. And it was a concern we had last year. You'll recall having this debate. Do we need to, okay, we get it. They need to have the ability, but to what extent? And remember, we put in that you had to notify the public, and you had to that was not in the original bill. And we're saying there needs to be more of a process, and we kind of held off on adding any more. I think these are just a few more sideboards that really give definition of the intent for parameters the commissioners have to function in.
Mr. Chairman.
All right.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank
can
you
I
very
just,
much. Mr. Reeman.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Haroldson, to build on that, there's only one county that I'm aware of that has utilized this particular provision, and that's the county we all knew was going to utilize it if it was available, and that's Laramie County, to move their fair board under a department. So that's correct. But to this bill, Representative Larson and I started this conversation last session around should there be sideboards, and he moved some language. So when he approached me about this, it wasn't, I didn't throw my hands up and say, heck no, we're not going to do that. I wanted to work with the representative to try and find that perfect place. And so I don't come to this bill with a position, frankly. I think that, absent the one major issue that I've identified, I don't think it's a bad bill, and the commissioners are not going to oppose it in this form.
Very good. Well, let's move along. Mr. Winnie, state your name for the record. Tell us what we need to know.
Chairman Washut, Bill Winnie, Sublette County. I support the bill. What do you do when an organization leadership goes off the rails? I remember as a very young Lieutenant JG in the Navy on a submarine communication officer, I saw a message go across the boards to another submarine that said, "Return to port, make best speed." And they cleaned out the leadership of that ship. Well, in the civilian world, we do things decently and in order. I got it. But there needs to be a mechanism to fix, and that's what I see with Representative Larson's thing is what do the county commissioners do? Well, step one, I think, would be, okay, guys, remember what your charter is and try and bring them back to whatever ground zero is. But then having something on the horizon, dissolution of the board or whatever for the special district is a way to get their attention. And organizations sometimes need an attention getter. Subject to your questions. Thank you.
Questions for Mr. Winnie? Thank you very much. Appreciate you. Anybody else in the room wishing to testify on 157? Anybody on Zoom land wanting to talk about 157? Okay. Any closing comments, Representative Larson?
Mr. Chairman, no.
Committee, what is your pleasure? Close public comment.
Move the bill.
Moved by Representative Craigo, second by Representative Oakley. Any proposed amendments, or do we want to wait for the floor? What's your pleasure? Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Page 3, lines 14 and 15, I'd move to strike those from the bill.
Moved by Representative Craigo, second by Representative Oakley to strike lines 14 and 15 on page 3 of the bill. Any discussion on the amendment? Representative Craigo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think we're going to create some confusion within the bill. I mean, what's the difference between misconduct and malfeasance? Let's just have one word in there that addresses all of that. And so that we're just not creating conflicting or confusing language. I think it's covered by Romanet 4. Everything that's included in 5 would be included up there, and just one less thing, few less words in the green book.
Further discussion on the amendment? Saying none, all in favor of Representative Craigo's amendment. Debbie, do we have the amendment clear in your mind?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay. All in favor of striking lines 14 or 15 on page 3 of the bill, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Representative Craigo's amendment to strike lines 14 or 15 on page 3 is passed. Any further amendments? Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm certainly open to discussion on this, but I don't like how it's worded, and I also don't like it substantively. So striking or board on page 3, line 3. And I would welcome again, even from the good representative, if possible, but the best interest of the residents of the district, okay, or board, that the board or district be dissolved. I don't know that it needs to be the best interest of the board too. I think it should be the best interest of the residents. And plus it just seems clunky or poorly worded, but I certainly open to
Is that a
discussion.
motion to strike the
Yes.
word or? Is there a second to second by Jennings? Discussion, Representative Craigo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure exactly what the amendment is.
I believe the amendment is to strike the word or on line 3
Or board.
or board.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or board. Okay, so we want to strike the words or board on line 3, page 3. Representative Craigo, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I see what we're trying to get at, but I think we need to maybe strike a few more words to actually get there, because if we strike or board, there are certain, it's just going to say district, and some of the entities that we're affecting under this statute aren't districts. And so it might be a friendly amendment, but it would say in the best interests of the residents, and then you would strike of the district or board, all 5 words, and that'll get to the same. That way we're covering districts and just general county residents.
Representative Oakley, is that friendly?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
So the amendment has morphed to delete of the district or board. And just all 5 of those words being stricken. Everybody clear on the amendment? Further discussion? Debbie, we have that?
Yes.
Striking all 5 words there on line 3. All in favor of this amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The amendment has passed. Any further amendments? Representative Jennings.
Mr. Chairman, on page 3, line 1, did we need to clarify that was strike appointed and put county commissioner board members so that we clarified? Or in the discussion, I wasn't sure if we needed to clarify who was making this dissolution.
Is that a motion?
Well, just putting it out there to see if I want to make a motion. Get a little more clarification to that.
Anybody want to give clarification? Representative Craigo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think we want to do that. I mean, the way that's drafted, it's specific to the appointed members on the board that we're talking about dissolving. And so that's one of the triggers, right? If the board comes to the county commissioners and says, hey, we don't think our board is serving a purpose anymore, or you don't need us. And so that's one of the triggers, along with these other other ones within there. So I think if we get to it, whether today or on the floor, but the amendment that Mr. Riemann was proposing would clarify that the county commissioners can also start that process, that they would have their own trigger based on, and I don't know, I think maybe none of us have that language down exactly in written form, but I think that's something we could do on the floor, and I'd be willing to help with that, putting that language together.
Further amendments? Seeing none, discussion on the bill. Question being called on the bill. House Bill 157, please call the roll.
Representative Cragel,
Aye.
Representative Chestick,
Aye.
Representative Haroldson, Representative Jennings, Representative Nemec, Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Provenza,
Aye.
Representative Rodriguez Williams,
Aye.
Chairman Washut.
Aye.
We have a total of 9 ayes.
Thank you, Representative Larson. Okay, it takes us to House Bill 172, Chairman Eklund. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Please introduce yourself and tell us what we need to know about House Bill 172. And I think you might have a witness with you today or not.
Maybe not, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee, for your time. It is. I'll move closer. My name is John Eklund. I'm representative in Eastern Laramie County. The way this bill started, and the reason I got involved, well, I'll just kind of explain that. A young friend of ours, she was our children's age, and I kept looking around trying to see if she could make it. She had some problems and probably won't get here in time. But because she was a little girl at the time, she kind of disappeared off of our radar. I'm not sure I would have recognized her if she'd walked in. Anyway, in 2005, she was assaulted by a man. She was a minor, I believe a sophomore in high school, and or thereabouts. But she was underage. The man was 15 years older. A rape kit or an assault kit was gathered, and then she married the man, had a family, and here we are 12, 15 years later, and she's in a divorce settlement scenario and a custody battle for these kids. And that assault kit would have helped in that case. And it's not in existence anymore. I did check DCI to see if it had been submitted, and it apparently wasn't. They've got digital records going back to 2001. So I don't know how the process of those things goes. They did have some physical evidence, but the rape kit itself wasn't there. So I thought one of the things I might be able to do, I felt that this was an egregious enough deal. It's had quite an effect on this young woman's life that I ought to be involved. And I'm kind of out of my wheelhouse. I'm used to more ag issues and those kinds of things. So what this bill does is requires that evidence be kept for a longer period of time. In this case, the meat of the bill is probably on page 2, line 2 through 5. And this paragraph's a little confusing for me, but others of you might understand why the minimum of 10 years have elapsed, why that's in there. And thereafter, upon the death of the person whose evidence was collected, or 50 years from the collection date, whichever occurs first. So my understanding is it's just those two things, the death of the victim or the 50 years after the collection date, which seems like a long period of time, and there's a possibility of reducing that and still being able to do what I think would be helpful for other people coming along, other young women coming along, or young people.
Mr. Chairman, if I could interrupt. You
Yeah,
just
go
a-
ahead.
It says the person whose evidence was collected, so that not necessarily the victim, could be perpetrator, could be someone else.
I believe it was victim. But that is unclear as well. That's the way I read it. I don't know if there's anything else. And that may be a change that you need to fix as well.
Mr. Chairman, I think your witness has arrived.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
She'll be able to fill in the gaps.
Okay.
And I guess before we start, we have some attorneys here. May I ask her one question quickly?
Question for Chairman, Representative Oakley.
Okay.
Thank you,
So-
Mr. Chair. What's the thought on let's discuss both of them, right? So the 10-year provision and the 50-year. I think 50 is excessive. We can talk about that later, but what are your thoughts about the 10 years thereafter upon the death of the person? But yeah, I think it's clunky language, but substantively, what's the thought of the 10 years?
Mr. Chairman, those weren't my thoughts. So I'm not sure when LSO drafted this, I communicated this story that I presented, and you'll probably get some more information on it. So I think the language is clunky too, and I don't know what the 10 years has to do with things, because we're talking about more like the 50 years or a longer period of time. So and because that's the meat of the bill, we've got attorneys here that can probably word craft this into something worthwhile.
This committee is good at word crafting, so we'll,
Good.
why don't we have your witness come forward if you wish.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, there, so she's in the middle of, if I understand things correctly, in the middle of a divorce settlement and didn't have time to talk to her attorney. Does that gonna affect things? We got attorneys here, maybe not, unsure. Okay.
So does she wish to testify or not?
You want to come forward?
You want to take a minute and visit with each other and Representative Eklund. Where are we
Mr.
at?
Chairman, my apologies. I think it would be better if she didn't come up. The first assault that would have been prosecuted, she was 16. And DCI didn't get it. It was processed or the kit was collected at the ER at the hospital. So that's that part.
Very good. Any further questions for Representative Eklund? Anyone else in the room wishing to testify on House Bill 172? Mr. Roderkoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Byron Odikoven, the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police. Let me start with a little background and clarify, maybe, if I don't muddy the waters on my way by, as it relates to the bill. So I think you're correct. The bill is narrowly tailored to discuss the length of time that evidence is preserved. So if we keep that in mind, then we can talk for a moment on collection of evidence, but not dwell on that much, because then we need to get back to the meat of the bill of how long it's preserved. So sexual assault investigation kits are a kit provided by the state that is utilized generally in the ER setting. And there are special circumstances where it can be other than there, but generally it's in the emergency room setting with what's called a SANE nurse, sexual assault examination nurse, which goes through specific procedures for the collection and preservation of that evidence. That evidence is not sent to the state for review as per previous statute worked by this body to ensure that folks would be willing to come in to share the evidence, if you will, have that evidence taken, but may not necessarily want to engage in prosecution at that moment. And thus that kit is preserved for a longer period of time as a just in case. If, however, and for background again, there's a degree of, if the prosecution does not go forward, that somehow that kit is no longer deemed viable in any manner for a prosecution, then the generally accepted practice is yes, it can be destroyed because it no longer has any evidentiary value. If it is still an unknown, those kits are preserved. So I think where we are with this particular discussion is a discussion that happened early on whether or not there was going to be a future prosecution. Unfortunately, then it was destroyed before that ultimate decision, so to speak, changed, the minds changed later. So without going into much of circumstance, I would like to focus back on the meat of the bill, and that's the 10-year and 50-year discussion. The International Association of Chiefs of Police in their model discussion suggests the sexual assault investigation evidence should be maintained for 50 years. Because circumstances change, DNA processes have changed, as we all know, over the course of time, and thus the opportunity for prosecution has changed with the advances of science. So the model discussion is 50 years. Where does that fall for agencies? If we're speaking in terms of the kits, once they're repackaged in proper form for evidence, is a very small footprint, if you will. While I hate to use examples like this, but it's something like the size of a cigar box kind of a thing, if you can think about that small chess set kind of a whatever frame of reference, but nonetheless a small box, sealed, tagged, and placed into evidence. What becomes troubling or becomes an issue from our membership in discussing the bill was the collateral evidence that is preserved. And without going into graphic detail or making suggestions, some of that evidence can become rather voluminous in its makeup as it's preserved for future reference. And that is in fact the case in some of our larger communities who are saying, well, we like the model policy, but we're very concerned about keeping some of that kind of evidence for that length of time based on the volume of evidence we would have. So I would ask that if you, as you consider that with those two thoughts in mind, it may be something to consider as you continue to wrestle with funding for cities, towns, and counties, to keep in the back of your mind that there's actions of the legislature do impact cost of doing business for local entities, and some of this evidence rooms and evidence collection. I know many communities who have started out with a room small, advanced to a room this size, advanced to a building, and now have multiple buildings to house evidence. So it can add up rather quickly depending upon the size of the community.
Mr. Overcoven,
thank you.
did these kits or this collateral evidence, does it need to be refrigerated, frozen, stored in any particular manner to protect it from degradation over time?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go out on a limb ever so slightly, so someone may correct me. Thank you. The kits themselves have a preserving agent within the sample collection that with the idea that those kits can be stored without special circumstances, generally sometimes referred to as high and dry, no humidity, dry climate, temperature control, can't be frozen, all of those kinds. So it needs to be in a heated environment for preservation. Likewise, when it comes to the biological evidence in that, there's a process and a procedure for drying and securing, and again, keeping it in that weather temperature, proper temperature climate environment is the accepted manner, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions, Representative Oakley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things, Mr. Odekoven. Thank you. So for discussion. So first of all, looking at this, the way we're reading it, this actually limits what's currently in statute, makes it less so. Because if you look at the stricken language, it basically, well, let me paraphrase that. It says no evidence shall be destroyed until, now this is the stricken language, all statutes of limitation have expired or a court orders the destruction. We don't have statute of limitations on our crimes. So you could read that it prohibits ever getting rid of evidence. So, but then I'm actually even more for the bill because I think it would make more sense to have some sideboards and because you could read that means that you cannot ever destroy them. So there's that for discussion. And then what was my other question for you? Oh, you were talking about the voluminous. As I read this, it is, 62309 is the medical examination of the victim of a sex assault. So it seems to me that this is narrowly about the sex assault kit. So I'd be interested if you are thinking of a specific, what other type of evidence that you think is required under the statute to be kept.
Mr.
I don't
Overcoven?
see that.
Mr. Chairman, as the members looked at this in the totality of a sexual assault investigation, the word back to me was the thought that it would contain that additional evidence. in the greater scope. I realize that 62308 talks about the medical examination, but during that medical examination, we routinely end up with the clothing and any other items that they may have. I'm doing my best to not be graphic, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Oderkoven, on page 2, line 3, talks about upon the death of the person whose evidence was collected. Are you clear whether we're talking about the victim, the perpetrator, or could it be both, or even a third party?
Mr. Chairman, listening to the question earlier and pondering it for a moment, we routinely do not do an examination kit. Well, let me back up. I apologize. So it's contemplated that the victim would be the first person who would end up with the kit. And as this statute is, or as the circumstances are contemplated, this is a victim in which probably the perpetrator is either unknown or known, but we aren't proceeding with the prosecution for some reason. If we're proceeding with a prosecution, if you will, or we have a perpetrator, yes, we would have a kit that would be completed on them as well. That's the other half of that evidentiary process. So I would say, Mr. Chairman, it would be both.
Representative Rodriguez-Williams, and then we'll go to Representative Cragel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Oderkoven, the way that I'm reading 62309 with the new language that's inserted on line 14 and 15, do you think this goes beyond just law enforcement when we talk about reports or other examination results or analysis and records? Does this perhaps affect also victim services and the Attorney General's office and their record keeping?
Mr. Oderkoven.
Mr. Chairman, I'm unaware of any evidence or records that the Attorney General's Victim Service would have that didn't originate with the original law enforcement report or information. I'm unaware of any independent information that they would have other than statistical and informational kinds of information. So at first blush, I would say that it would not impact them.
Representative Cragel, you were next, and then Representative Volka.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have a question. I was just going to say, I read this provision as only applying to the victim because that's really what we're talking about in 62309. I mean, that is the same kit statute. And so I don't think it's not going to be evidence collected against the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator. It's going to be evidence collected on the victim. And so I don't think we're talking about, I think we're only talking about one person here.
Okay, Representative Oakley, your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going back to if we wanted to tweak or make sure that we are referring specifically to the kit instead of other evidence. And what your thoughts are on that, Mr. Oderkoven. No evidence, record, report, or other exam results or analysis collected or created under subsection A. And then but again, it refers to this examination of the victim.
Mr. Chairman, maybe if I may, let me jump in and hopefully not muddy the waters. So Baron, as we consider this as the kit, if we continue down that discussion of the kit, the rest of the evidence is already governed by records retention, state archives. The rest of the evidence for Part 1 crime is considered to be in perpetuity. In most cases, the homicide evidence, et cetera, there's a discussion that evidence is to be kept until the full statute of limitations kinds of things are fully complete. So on one hand, that and I hate to keep saying the word collateral because it may not be artfully correct to the discussion, but nonetheless, we understand that additional evidence is probably governed by other rules and would be held and preserved.
Mr. Oderkoven, on page 4, line 5, I think we get into the topic of bulky, oversized evidence items, so I think it is mentioned in here, or at least referenced. Your comments?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that reference, beginning on page 3 and working on through the beginning of page 4 would include that additional evidentiary items.
Question for Representative Eklund. I know this may not be your area, but if we were to limit this bill completely to the examination kit and only have the language in this bill affect that kit, does that achieve the end that you're desiring?
Mr. Chairman, committee, I think so. Because there are already requirements on any of the other evidence that was collected, I believe, by law. We were talking about the other evidence. Page 4, Romanet 3, that's retention. Oh, well, maybe it doesn't. I believe the part that is missing is that kit. In this particular case, that's what I was.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess this would be a good question for Mr. Odekoven. Do we know exactly what the evidence retention policy is? I don't off the top of my head know what that is, but what is evidence? What is our evidence retention policy for local law enforcement?
Mr. Chairman,
Specific to a kit. Mr. Odekoven, or more broadly?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I just want to know more broadly, not the kit, because I think this governs the kit. I want to know what the evidence retention policy is outside the kit so that if we're not mirroring them, or if there isn't some tie there, then I'm just trying to get to what the purpose of the bill is, because I'm not sure I still understand it. And I'm sorry, I'm just asking these questions so I can figure that out.
Mr. Odekoven.
Mr. Chairman, and I may stand corrected later, and I will double check, but I believe that in sexual assault felony level, that evidence is preserved forever. Having said that, there is a statute with our until everybody, if there's no longer any parties that could be, or people pass away, then there's an opportunity for destruction with a court order. So I will need to verify that. So to make sure I did not incorrectly state that. I think, if I may, as to the kit itself, there is, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's an opportunity for kits that aren't going forward, if you will, clearly not going forward, to be destroyed. And I think that's the circumstance that we're in, as the example that was going to be discussed, is it was a kit that was taken, clearly not going forward, thus not preserved. The bill would say, irregardless of that decision, the kit will be preserved, if I understand correctly.
So, Mr. Odekoven, it seems like this, we gather evidence for a criminal case, and then in this matter, it sounds like maybe it's a case dealing with paternity or something non-criminal. I'm not sure, given the testimony we've had today. So at what point does the law enforcement agency have a duty to preserve evidence for something outside of the criminal process?
Mr. Chairman, let me take a two-pronged answer to that. And the first one would be, I'm not sure we have a duty to preserve evidence for a non-criminal matter. On the second half, I think if there's evidence that we have that could be used and the court deems it appropriate, they could use it.
Further questions for Mr. Odekoven? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here today. Might stay close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else in the room wishing to testify on this bill? 172, Ms. Nance.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to come up.
Please state your name.
Oh, I apologize. Beth Lance on behalf of the Wyoming Trial Lawyers Association today. Just with a few comments. Certainly, the goal of this bill is well taken. WTLA would support the goal of this bill, which is to ensure that these kits are maintained and that they're maintained for an extraordinary amount of time, I understand, but that ensures twofold. It ensures that if a victim at some point is seeking prosecution and the state is seeking prosecution, that can occur. And it also ensures, and I think this is important, that the accused potentially of such a sexual assault crime or related crime will, if they are innocent, potentially be exonerated because there is DNA evidence available. So I think it's important on both sides. And I think the important piece here from what we've heard from the person's experience that brought about this bill is that it seems to be that in existing statute, there is a way to obtain a court order to destroy the evidence should the prosecutors at the time feel there's no reason to move forward. And I think the difference here is the bill just simply requires that the evidence is maintained for a significant period of time. So in the event there is a change and the prosecutor and the victim potentially goes back to law enforcement, back to the prosecutor, and is seeking at that time a prosecution, that it would be possible because the evidence would still be preserved. And seems to be that is the concern of the example that was provided. And I would stand for any questions.
Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Lynch. So what do you think about, what do you think about the reading that it already says it shall not be destroyed until all applicable statutes of limitation have expired? I mean, in essence, this is limiting what's required. Am I reading, is that the same reading that you have?
Ms. Lance.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Oakley, yes, absolutely, because you're correct. For crimes, there is no statute of limitations in this state of Wyoming. I think the difference here is this bill does take out or a court order. And I think I could see a situation where a prosecutor could explain to a court that it could go ahead and be destroyed, and potentially the victim would at a later date, maybe they're in a coercive, abusive situation, and so they're not willing to cooperate potentially as a witness. And so the prosecutor doesn't have a case at that time, and potentially they could mature, things could change, they could get out of a coercive, abusive relationship and then want to actually seek prosecution. And so I could see a situation where it could be sought for a court order to destroy, and potentially that isn't justice because the victim then it doesn't have the opportunity later.
Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you want court order in there is what we're saying.
Ms. Lance.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think that would have prevented the situation that's been brought before this committee.
Representative Shesty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lance, we've had some conversation, you've heard, I think, about the possible ambiguity on section on page 2, line 3, the person whose evidence. I do agree with the country lawyer from on the bench up here that I think that because of the prior language, it does really cover just the victim's evidence, but there is possibly some ambiguity there. But I'm more concerned about the policy here. Do you think it's okay to, if the victim has died and 10 years later they destroy the evidence, would you still want to preserve the evidence even if the victim is dead? Because perhaps the perpetrator, the sexual assault perpetrator is still alive and may be prosecuted for a series of other crimes, or might there be some use of that evidence, even though the victim is dead, that might be useful in some other proceeding against a serial offender?
Ms. Nance?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Chestick, that's certainly a concerning example. And I think that this good committee can look again at potentially the original language, which would allow for it to not be destroyed pursuant to statute of limitations in Wyoming, which is currently none. So
Ms. Lance, I'm trying to, if we have an analysis is actually done at the crime laboratory and we get, I'm assuming, some type of numerical representation of the DNA, is that sufficient to be retained if we have that numerical representation of what that was? Or do we still have to maintain part of the remaining sample for comparative analysis down the road? I'm just trying to think about space considerations.
Mr. Chairman, I understand the question. I don't know that these kids take up all that much space. I would hope that this would be important enough that the state could, or local agencies could provide space for storage. In the event that that is a concern, I would just suggest putting a very significant amount of years on any destruction. I think that you could come into questions regarding chain of custody. I mean, you're going to have to potentially have more than just the specific data of the DNA.
Doesn't look like any more questions. Thank you, Ms. Lance. Appreciate it. Anyone else wishing to testify on House Bill 172? Anybody on Zoom land? Anybody else in the room? Back to the sponsor.
Mr. Chairman. Just kind of a few gaps. The initial assault happened when she was 16. The perpetrator went to prison. Upon his return out of prison, they married, and here we are years later trying to do a divorce settlement, and evidence that may have helped her in that is gone. And I don't understand the mechanics of all of that. It's been really interesting. As far as the language goes, I would welcome any word drafting you can do. All statute law is clunky to me. And those of you who know me know what I'm talking about. But anyway, I would appreciate your consideration on this bill. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. With that, I'll close public comment. Committee, what's your preference? Moved by Chester, second by Oakley. Any proposed amendments at this point, or do we want to work them on the floor? Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope I'm getting this right. My amendment would be page 1, line 16. Strike the word until. Add unless pursuant to a court order. Pursuant to a court order or upon a minimum of 10 years. No, that doesn't make sense. Hold on. Or a minimum of 10 years have elapsed. I think just or. Does that make sense?
So you're putting the court order back in,
Yes.
but then we
Okay.
could have a court order to kill it. And we'd have that back in place. It's a court order.
The Representative Oakley, you want
I think.
to read that through, or Secretary can gather it all? Just how will that paragraph read after your amendment?
Okay, so starting on page 1, line 16. Well, subsection A of this section. So no evidence under subsection A of this section shall be destroyed unless pursuant to a court order or, and then continue on, a minimum of 10 years have elapsed in there upon the death.
Second.
Motion by Representative Oakley, second by Representative Rodriguez Williams. Debbie, did you capture that? Would you read it back? Make sure, confirm to the sponsor of the amendment that we have it.
They'll be destroyed unless pursuant to a court order or a minimum of 10 years.
Yes.
We have that correct? Representative Chester.
Are we in discussion of the amendment?
Thank you. I think it's seconded by Rodriguez Williams already, but
Okay.
discussion on the amendment?
Yes.
Okay,
I have
discussion on
discussion.
amendment.
Yes. I wonder if the or at the end of that amendment should be and. Because when you say or, you could have a court order earlier than 10 years after have elapsed. So you want both of those conditions to be fulfilled. You want either one. So there's a court order that can violate the other version,
Representative Oakley.
override those.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, a court order stands alone. I don't want the time and a court order. No.
So Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to wrap my non-lawyer brain around this, sorry, guys. So statute of limitations, we don't have a statute of limitations, which means this has to be held for eternity. Okay, so we're eliminating that. We had a court order before, which in my opinion, probably is where the evidence that is in question in this certain case that has brought this bill forward was eliminated. So now we're reinserting the mechanism with no stipulations upon it, that mechanism is back in place to eliminate this information again. So I almost feel like we're adding all of these stipulations of 10 years after the death of the individual and or 50 years. And then we are turning around and basically saying, or a court order. So we could have a deal where that case could close next week and court says, never mind, we don't need that anymore, get rid of it. And we're right back where we started. And maybe I'm completely off, but that's how I read that. Am I right?
Representative Oakley, you want to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think you said it well when you said the mechanism, like understanding that a court order in and of itself sort of represents a due process of sorts.
I get it.
So it just isn't something that's arbitrary when it's pursuant to a court order. So it doesn't, I personally think pursuant to a court order is basically, I hate to say always, but I think it's appropriate. So because again, it represents for some reason the court ordered it, or then we also have these time limitations. So both mechanisms, but I guess I just sort of trust the process, the mechanism of a court order personally from my career.
Representative Provenza. Follow up, Representative Harold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So do we feel the court order eliminated the evidence that we're talking about in this certain case? That'd be my question.
I don't know.
Don't think we know.
But sorry,
All right.
Chairman, but if we have a statute of limitations, which makes it where we can't legally get rid of it, the court orders are only option. And I'm reading that correctly.
Yeah, but we're striking the statute.
Representative Oakley, you want to respond? Let's not have side conversation. Let's talk about it. Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess a question for the process of the court order. I don't want to bog us down on it, but I think given this discussion, I'm trying to understand. So would maybe a court order, what would be those instances where a court order would order for evidence to be deleted or, I mean, destroyed? Would that maybe be the evidence was taken illegally or inappropriately and violated rights of the accused or the persons that they collected the evidence from? What would that look like?
Committee, before we answer that, it's 9 o'clock. We have 2 more bills on our agenda. So I'm going to suggest that perhaps more substantive amendments wait for the floor, but it's obviously the pleasure of the committee. But Representative Oakley, if you can respond to Representative Provenza's question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I'll decline. I mean, I don't understand what happened here. I don't know. And I'm not gonna just wing examples because I really don't have any. Sorry.
Very good. Any further amendments to the bill? Do we have to vote on this amendment yet? Is that where we're at? All right. So we have the amendment starting on line 16, page 1. Everybody clear on what the amendment is? Question on the amendment? All those in favor of Representative Oakley's amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The amendment has passed. Further amendments? Representative Shestak?
I have a very simple one-word amendment to clarify something we've been talking about. On page 2, line 3, change the word person to victim. That's the only change. The reason for that, I think the good country lawyer does have a good point that under N, it refers to subsection A, which is the rape kit. So I do believe that it's probably not ambiguous, but a victim or a perpetrator could say, that's my DNA you're looking for. I'm the person whose evidence is collected. It was my DNA that was collected. So there is a possible ambiguity there. I think it's easy to clear it up by just changing the word person to victim.
I'll second that motion on the amendment. Is there any discussion on the amendment? Representative Oakley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm against that for 2 reasons. So the language is the person whose evidence was collected. I think that's clear. And then even though, and it already says victim in the title 62309, medical examination of victim. That's what this is under. So that's already there. And in that way, I actually hesitate sometimes to overuse the word victim because I think the person whose evidence was collected is probably more accurate because at this point, I don't know. It's a person whose evidence was collected. We don't know if they're a victim technically until it's adjudicated, and it also already refers to victims. So I think it's unnecessary on and against.
Thank you. I still find it a little ambiguous and so if we do an examination and we remove biological material of the perpetrator from the victim, whose evidence is that? Which person's evidence are we talking about? We took the perpetrator's biological evidence from the victim. Who's the person? Whose evidence is that? So that's where I see the ambiguity. If anybody wants to comment. No further discussion. We have a vote on the amendment to strike the word person on line 3, page 2, replaced with the word victim. Debbie, have that? Okay, all those in favor of Representative Shestak's amendment, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment has failed. Anything further? Seeing none. Question on the bill. We'll call the roll.
Representative Craigo,
No.
Representative Chestick,
Aye.
Representative Harrelson,
No.
Representative Jennings, Representative Nemec,
Aye.
Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Provenza,
Aye.
Representative Rodriguez Williams,
Aye.
and Chairman Washut.
Aye.
We have a total of 6 ayes and 3 noes.
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify my pause there and want to make clear for the committee that I have some hesitation that this bill is not ready for prime time. If we can get it there by 3rd reading, great. If we can't, I may be a no vote. So just want to give you all a respectful heads up.
Thank you very much. That brings us to House Bill 186. Representative Crevenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I bring to you today House Bill 186, Court Appointed Attorneys Fee Prohibition for Minors. My name is Carly Provenza. I represent Albany County, House District 45. As you know, since I sit here on this committee with you. Basically, what we're trying to do here, currently the state of Wyoming is charging some youth offenders or their families for a service that is currently a constitutional right under the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The process that we currently use is detailed on page 4 of the bill and some in that stricken language. And so some of what you'll see is shall require verification of financial condition. This would be an under oath affidavit, sworn testimony. And as I'm sure you can imagine, somebody having to kind of go under oath and state that they don't have funds or swear to an affidavit could be potentially embarrassing or shameful situation. And then it says if a child requests counsel and parents won't pay, the court may direct reimbursement under 14-6-235C. If they can pay, that court requires record of why they won't. Obviously, in contentious family issues, you could see how this might be troublesome. And so by definition, people qualifying for a public defender, they are already economically disadvantaged. Kids who come from privileged families are likely going to be able to hire a private attorney. They will not be utilizing the services of our public defender's office. Furthermore, while this seems to make sense as, you know, maybe this further punishment might deter further actions in the future, we don't see any evidence for that, particularly with juveniles and youth. Money might not even be coming from them. Is it actually deterring further behavior? And finally, I would suggest also that fees in these instances aren't necessarily about punishment. They're a tax to fund the government. Is this the appropriate place to do that? Committee, that will be up to you. Currently, we estimate that there are about $25,000 statewide collected in fees for the public defender's office through this consideration. But you can imagine by the time we get done with the time utilized for judges, bailiffs, sheriffs, anybody else in this system, that it might even cost us more than that. Montana, for example, has spent $303,000 to collect less than $175,000. And then we also know that several Idaho counties and some of these states are considering the same sort of legislation right now. They are losing money every year trying to collect on these fees. So that brings, that's the genesis of this bill, trying to ensure that if someone is indeed needing the use of a public defender, which is their constitutional right, that we are not charging them. And just kind of walk you through the bill real quick. If I can find the right draft I have here, probably don't have it. So if you look on page 2, lines 1 through 3, this just removes minor youth from determination of need and reimbursement of the state. We go down in paragraph C, we have representation of needy persons. Is that Wyoming statute 7-6-104 that is being referenced. The stricken language is removing minors. And then on page 3, 7-6-105A that's referenced on line 11, we're talking about the advisement of rights, appointment of attorney. So and then we're adding paragraph J, which the main point might be the main point of the bill. So no court may assess fees or costs against a minor or the minor's custodial parent or any other person obligated by law. On page 4, we kind of walk through that, some of the procedures that exist now. And then section 3 and 4 are your shall apply to proceedings beginning after the effective date, which would be immediately. Committee, I will stand for questions. I'll also mention there might be an amendment coming from potentially the public defender's office or advocacy groups. And that'll be up to the committee what they want to decide. I think they will have more information about why.
Okay.
So.
Questions for Representative Provenza? Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just in summing it up, in essence, this takes away the judicial discretion to determine a child defendant's ability to pay. It absolutely just says precludes and these minors that are, we've talked about this before, availing themselves, whether willfully or not, of the court system. So, and then those costs have to be borne by somebody else. Do you think that's accurate?
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Representative Oakley, Mr. Chairman. I mean, what I would argue is that what this does, while maybe taking discretion away from the court, I would say that it was not the intention of the United States Constitution or its writers to impose that. The entire point of providing a public defender was to ensure that everyone had a right to a defense. And again, we're estimating the total amount collected in fees to be less than $25,000. You'll see on the fiscal note of the bill, we're not seeing a significant fiscal or personnel impact. So I'm not sure that this is necessarily going to bring a burden onto taxpayers.
Follow up, Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What was that? You said like $300,000 collecting fees, or what was that referring to Wyoming? Oh, okay. Are you asserting that Wyoming's spending a significant amount of money collecting fees, and this is fixing that problem?
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Oakley. I am not sure. I don't have the information for that, so I don't want to opine on if that's the case or not. What I am trying to provide with that information is that in states that are collecting, they often are spending more to get that money. So maybe Wyoming is bucking that trend. I'm not sure, but that is, yeah, I don't have that information in short.
So Representative Provenza, just so I'm clear here. We have a minor and that minor has $1,000 in his bank account. Not enough to hire a lawyer, but perhaps something to contribute toward the cost of that public defender. Why, in your opinion, is it inappropriate for the court to assess at least part of that $1,000 in his bank account toward the reimbursement of a public defender?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm under the standards of which we set for what is considered indigent. So a person whose annual gross income is less than 125% of the current federally established poverty level. That would be the concern. I certainly can understand, looking at a minor's bank account with $1,000 is potentially expendable income. However, if we have a minor who's living with a family who's maybe they have to work and that money is there for expenses that they will need, it's difficult to kind of take an anecdotal story and apply this when I think the reality is that at large, what we're saying as a state is that we respect your Fifth Amendment right to a point. And in my opinion, Mr. Chairman, I would say that we should just respect your Fifth Amendment right, period.
Representative Provenza, but everybody has Fifth Amendment right to counsel. So why don't we provide an attorney for everybody, regardless of their means, following that line of reasoning?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I believe that the Fifth Amendment says if you can't be afforded to you, certainly, Mr. Chairman, you know Miranda rights. And so if an attorney can be afforded to you, if you cannot afford one, that is the assumption of the constitutional amendment. And so it's not, our Constitution does not say that we should give free legal counsel to every person. Instead, it says to those that could not otherwise provide a fair defense.
I would beg to differ that the Fifth Amendment does not say anything about your ability to pay. That's been interpretation in court case law, but Fifth Amendment, it says you have a right to counsel. Other question, Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So currently under our current practice, if an individual is unable to, or in a financially, just in a lower position financially, those are being waived currently, are they not?
Representative Provenza.
I think, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a great question for the Public Defender's Office. I believe that that's likely, it's often being waived. It might be cases where it has some sort of a burden where they don't necessarily fall in that line. But I would defer to the folks that are kind of in the room for those discussions.
Any further questions for Representative Provenza? None. Thank you. State agencies. Good morning. Please state your name and agency for the record. And
Good
tell
morning.
us what we need to know.
Good morning, Chairman Washut. My name is Diane Lozano, Lozano. I'm the State Public Defender and have been in that position since 2007. I'm not new to this committee, but new to some of you. I will warn you that I talk fast and I will try to go slow. As you know, I cannot take a position on a bill and I cannot amend a bill, but I thought rather today I would give you some context that might help you make a decision, talk to you about the data I have, the data I don't have, and then the impact on the Office of the State Public Defender. First, I think it's important to note that we're conflating two steps of a process. So let's talk about how a person qualifies to get a public defender. First, that person has to be charged with a serious crime in violation of the state of Wyoming laws. So a misdemeanor or felony offense, sometimes contempt. Then that person has to be determined to be needy. In the proposed bill, where that determination is made is 76106B and the lined out, and in the case of the unemancipated minor. So the first thing a court has to do is to determine if the person's charged with a serious crime. And then based on financial information provided by all defendants, not just juveniles and not just their parents, in a confidential affidavit that is sealed from public review, the court must determine whether or not they qualify. As this committee and members of this committee might remember, the Public Defender's Office found itself in a constitutional crisis in 2019 because caseloads became unmanageable. What this committee did and this body as a whole did was to make it more clear who qualifies. And so it's important that only people who are financially deemed needy by a court get a public defender. To skip that process would to increase my caseloads and my attorney's caseloads, and we would be back in a constitutional or ethical crisis in terms of proper representation for a juvenile in a case. So 76106 is required by law, by the court, whether it's a juvenile or an adult defendant, to determine whether or not that person is needy. That finding has nothing to do with whether or not public defender fees are ordered at the end of a case. So if the court appoints a public defender based on those two criteria, paperwork goes to the local field office, an attorney is assigned, counsel is provided via the Sixth Amendment, I believe, of the Constitution to that child. A court in juvenile court and in any court when determining neediness has to look at what other resources an individual has. So with a child, you're looking at the parents. With an adult, you might be looking at the spouse, ability to borrow money from an aunt. So it's a full-blown holistic approach to whether or not a person can pay for a private attorney. Okay, so back to an attorney's assigned, you go through the process. A juvenile is adjudicated delinquent or chins. Those are the cases the public defender's office handles. At the end of that case, the court then determines whether or not there's an ability to pay public defender fees. And how the court knows what the public defender fees are is my attorneys have to tell the court, pursuant to a mandatory fee reimbursement schedule, what that case cost the state of Wyoming. And it's discounted, if you will. A juvenile delinquency case, our mandatory fee schedule is $750. Then the court, pursuant to the 14th Amendment, determines whether or not that child or that child's family has the ability to pay. Once that order is imposed, then it's up to DFS, who's supervising the child, whether in detention or otherwise, to set up a payment plan. And that child and or that child's parent makes payments to the district court. The district court collects that and then periodically sends checks to the public defender's office. Sometimes those checks have itemized case information. Sometimes they do not. I doubt that district courts are including juvenile case names in collection of public defender fees. But I don't know. You would have to ask the district courts who's paying what. So I don't have that data for you. My office then takes that check and gives it to the state auditor's office, and that money is deposited into the general fund. So that money does not go back to the public defender's office, but it is revenue that I have to report in our annual report. So let me give you some data in terms of fiscal year 2022 to give you some context of what we do and what we collect. In fiscal year 2022, my office was appointed to represent 12,629 defendants. Of those, 471 were juveniles. During that time period, my office closed 472 juvenile cases. In all of those cases, the courts found that public defender fees were incurred of $750, maybe less, maybe more, depending on what the work was on those cases. And then the court determined that only 47 of those cases, that the juvenile or the juvenile's family would have to reimburse the state for public defender fees. I would note that there is
Excuse me,
Supreme.
Can you state that again? Only 47 had to?
Had
or
to
were
pay.
able to?
Had to pay. So 47 of 472 juveniles were ordered to pay. I do not know those amounts. I do not know if they've been collected yet or what they will be in the future, because those fees are paid over the lifetime of that child's case with DFS. So it could be years. So I don't know. And there's no way I could collect that information because it's not paid to my office. As far as I know, the district court clerks do this in all public defender cases. They collect restitution in all criminal cases. And so I don't know that there's a cost of collection. I have a fiscal officer who does a lot of things, and one of those includes collecting the check and taking it to SAO. And then SAO gives us the amount we collected at the end of the year, and we report that in our annual report. So to my knowledge, there is not a cost of collection of public defender fees in juvenile cases in the state of Wyoming. There is Supreme Court case law that says the right to counsel means you have a lawyer who's present with you, has to be competent, has to provide constitutionally ethical representation. But there is a case, and I don't know it off the top of my head, and I can go find that for you, that this United States Supreme Court has said ordering someone to reimburse after the fact, after a 14th Amendment finding of ability to pay is made, does not violate the right to counsel. Are there any questions for me?
Questions from Ms. Lozano? See none. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
For those in the room waiting to see whether or not we're going to get to House Bill 214, my best guess is we will not get to House Bill 214 this morning, and we'll lay that back for Monday. Any further witnesses on House Bill 186? Come on Zoom. Yeah, bring them in, please. Whoever's on Zoom, bring them in. Ms. Sheen, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
We can. Okay, please state your
thank-
name, who you represent, and your comments on this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Donna Sheen, and I am the director of the Wyoming Children's Law Center and also a member of the Wyoming Youth Justice Coalition, who's advocated for changes in juvenile fees, including the bill that's before you today. I want to start by saying that we do and did try and work closely with the Public Defender's Office. We do understand the fiscal side of why we may want to try and recoup fees. But one of the reasons that we believe this bill is important is because this isn't imposing them oftentimes on the youth, who is the one who we're trying to hold accountable. This is imposing costs on families of the youth, and families, by the way, who've already been determined to be a needy family. In other words, 218% of poverty. And so what we see in reality is that we're imposing fees on families in a very difficult time, where perhaps they've also been required to pay child support because the child's been removed from the home, and they've faced other financial costs because of the situation. They may be required to do certain things or have their child do certain things. And so overall, it just increases incrementally the burden that's on families at a time when we're trying to help them restabilize and help their child to be reformed from this process, so to speak. So that in general is the reason. And what the research shows is that these kinds of fees actually do impact the outcomes of the case. And in fact, a lot of times the case can't close, for example, until somebody's paid that fee. And so it extends out the length of the case and the overall cost. So these are all hidden fees that research has shown makes it very counterproductive. Not only that, but makes it more likely that the youth is going to there's going to be some kind of bad outcome. They're either not going to complete probation successfully or perhaps recidivate. So we wanted to bring this issue to you to talk a little bit about what we can do to help youth and families. What Ms. Lozano testified is there is only the 47 who were ordered to be reimbursed. And I think what we see in practice is that there's a wide variety of ways that courts interpret whether or not they should order these kinds of fees to be reimbursed. And so part of what we see as a frustration is, again, that unequal justice across the state of Wyoming, where certain jurisdictions do not ever order the family to reimburse the public defender, but in other jurisdictions they do quite frequently. So we feel like there is no financial benefit to the state for us to continue requiring that reimbursement because it isn't happening very often. And in every case that it's happening in, these are families where they've already had an exhaustive review of their financial situation, and they are in a position where they're needy and more than likely can't pay, even if they are ordered to. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the bill as it is and what we tried to work with the public defender to make workable. And so I did provide a potential amendment. What would happen if the bill were passed the way it is? My understanding is it would then just base the financial need on the child, whether or not the child is able to pay for their public defender or not. So as Chairman Washut mentioned, what if the child has some money in the bank? Then there is that potential that the court could order that child to pay that $1,000 that they had in financial assets. But it wouldn't if the parent were the one that had the financial resources. I think what when talking with Ms. Lozano, one of her concerns was that if that language were passed as it is, where it takes the parent's financial position completely out of the picture, they may see a rise in cases. And so what we did is go back through the bill and took a look at if we left that language in. So in other words, if we say, if the child or the parents' financial resources are looked at and neither one of them has the financial resources to hire their own private counsel, then the public defender's office would be appointed. But then it would be determined then that they would not need to pay any further fees. And we believe that's a fair outcome given the situation. These parents, I mean, sometimes they may have been the victim. It may have been a fight at home that, a child got unruly and attacked a parent, and then that parent is not only the victim of the crime, but also being ordered. Now, granted, that judge may factor that in and not order the reimbursement, but again, there's no cost or there's no standard that we've provided the court in terms of when it's appropriate to order them, the parents, to reimburse that fee or not. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Questions for Ms. Sheen? Thank you for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to testify? Ms. Lance, are you up? State your name and agency for us. Begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Beth Lance. I'm here on behalf of the Wyoming Trial Lawyers Association. Hearing the prior testimony and comments on the bill, I'm now presently maybe unsure what the goal is here. Certainly, WTLA supports what is currently here, which is that the courts would not be assessing fees or costs against minors for representation. That is contained in this bill. I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One of which is in Wyoming, we have juveniles in all levels of our courts. So juveniles can be brought before a municipal court or circuit court or into juvenile district court. And so there are occasions where I think the lower level courts who typically just handle adult cases issue potentially large fines, costs, and things to children, and that can be difficult, obviously, for those kids to pay. And I'm not sure that that is in the best interests of our judicial system or children. So that's certainly a piece of this bill that I think is positive. However, it does obviously also go into way into the concept of juvenile court and when parents are asked to file financial affidavits to potentially have their child then qualify for a public defender. This seems to take that completely away. And so this bill would essentially create a situation where it states that neither minors nor their parents would be at all obligated. And so I do see that then public defenders would be placed into all certainly juvenile cases to represent children, which, you know, in some ways may be a good policy. We would be sure that all children have proper representation, certainly, but obviously that does come with a cost.
Questions for Ms. Lance? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to testify? Anybody else in Zoom land for one of these? Anybody else wishing to testify on this bill? Back to the sponsor for a summary, and then we'll bring it to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, I won't take any more of your time. Thank you for your consideration. I hope that even if there are some things we want to amend, I hope we can move forward with this and move in the right direction. So thank you.
Committee, what's your preference? Moved by Representative Chester, second by Craigo. Any proposed amendments on the bill? Representative Provenza, do you have an amendment? No. No amendments? Discussion on the bill. Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it was a really good discussion. Really appreciate the state public defender being here. That was a good rundown recitation, but what I took from it was it's working. The system's working. The system's working and the statutory structure around that, right? So we talked about the holistic approach based on their ability to pay. Judges are looking at that. In this instance, 471 juveniles and 47, so 10%, the vast majority are waived when it's reviewed at that number, 90%. So we're talking about a relatively negligible amount of people, but nonetheless, I think it's important for the judiciary to have that ability to look at it. So it seems to me that it's working fine as it is. So on and against.
Other discussion on the bill? Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so one of the things I think I just, every one of these individuals will have a right to a fair trial. That this doesn't change that at all. All this changes is the potential for a 10% slot for those individuals to be waived of that fee. And I'll be honest with you, I believe one of the things that the fee concept that I do like is we're not, this is a way for a penalty. This is a form of a penalty for an infraction, I feel. And in this situation, that's something that the court deems they can afford. And so I think there's a point too where this isn't something that's going to put them behind bars. This isn't something where you pay or you're in trouble. This is a deal. We'll work out a system for you to pay this back. And I don't know, maybe I'm off, but I think if I would have gotten in trouble as a child, my parents would have been like, oh yeah, he's paying those fees because of the reality of the fact that there has to be a consequence to action. And I think this is in this situation where they can't afford it. There's no possible way they're waiving that. 90% of the time they're waiving that. In that 10% window, that isn't the case. And I believe they have just cause for that. So on and against.
Further discussion. Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, envisioning these anecdotal stories and parents wanting kids to pay. And I understand that. When I was 15, I had a job. I dropped out of school and worked because my family was poor. And so there's certainly there's times to waive fees. In the case in which a child might have fees where they can't afford them, but they've been ordered them, they could also waive their right to an attorney, which I think would be incredibly detrimental. So I hope we can support this bill and move forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Provenza. My comments are this is once again, Judiciary Committee is being asked to make a policy decision where we have a dearth of Wyoming data. We had some data on Montana. So I'm hopeful that the changes that we made last year in terms of juvenile data will pay dividends down the road, that we're going to be able to say, because frankly, if we are in the same boat as Montana, where we're spending $300,000 to collect $100,000, cost benefit analysis tells us that's probably bad policy. But without that data, I don't know that I'm comfortable making changes in a system that seems like it's largely working. Judges have discretion, so I'll probably be a no vote today. With that, let's call for a question. Question called. Please call the roll on House Bill 186.
Representative Craigo. Aye. Representative Chestick.
Aye.
Representative Harrelson. Representative Jennings. Representative Nemec.
No.
Representative Oakley.
No.
Representative Provenza.
Aye.
Representative Rodriguez Williams.
No.
And Chairman Weishut.
No.
We have a total of 3 ayes and 6 noes.
With that, House Bill 186 has failed to pass House Judiciary Committee. Members, just remember the speaker encouraged the chairman to make sure that everybody was back on the floor at 10 o'clock. And so please make sure you're counted for the quorum. Excuse me?
Mr. Chairman, I think we could get this one in if we hurried.
We'll see you on Monday. We're going to lay back 241 for Monday.